On February 6, 1955, a young Elvis Presley was introduced to a local businessman named Colonel Tom Parker in a cafe in Memphis, Tennessee. Parker was a friend of Elvis's manager, Mr. Bob Neal, and he felt like Parker had the connections in the entertainment industry to bring Elvis's career to the next level.
Elvis, I'm sure you know. At this point in his career, he was tearing up the American South with his three-piece band. He was 20 years old, and he was developing into the teen idol that's still a household name today. Now, Colonel Tom Parker, you may be less familiar with. Soon after this 1955 meeting, he became Elvis's manager and began to control his career with an iron grip. He did take Elvis to the next level, with 1956 being an explosive year for the young singer's career. He had some of his most successful singles, his first LP, 2 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, and the filming of his first movie, Love Me Tender. It was great for Elvis. For a little while.
Hi, I'm Jake.
And I'm Dan, and we're both public high school teachers. Now, Elvis's life is not all tragedy, but since this is a video about his death, it's gonna skew a little negative. The seeds that led to an early demise were planted long before 1977, and so were the signposts of a conspiracy. Now, Elvis's career can be slotted into a couple pretty distinct sections, so we're gonna take them one at a time, tracking the collapse of his health and the reasons why he might want to fake his own death.
In 1956, Elvis was recording at the Memphis recording service, home of Sun Records, where he cut his first several releases. Working with producer Sam Phillips and guitarist Scotty Moore, bassist Philip Black, and later drummer DJ Fontana, Elvis recorded much of his most iconic stuff here. It was really where he got big. He recorded a mix of country, western, rhythm and blues, and honky-tonk numbers. And some people make this out to sound a lot more simple than it is, and it was complicated. And this is where Elvis did his part to help racially integrate rock and roll, and in many ways profit off many of the black artists that never got their due.
This is when Elvis met the aforementioned Colonel Tom Parker, whose name was not Tom Parker, by the way, nor was he a colonel. In our opinion, Tom Parker was the worst thing that ever happened to Elvis. Born Andreas Cornelius Van Kujic, Parker immigrated to the States when he was 20 and got a job as a carnival worker. Living as an undocumented citizen for the rest of his life, he disallowed Elvis from ever playing outside the US. He also used some of Elvis's stage banter recordings to record some of the worst albums ever made in having fun with Elvis on stage. His goal was always to increase the quality of the deal, no matter how much toll it took on the creative vision or mental health of those involved. While he made them loads of cash, Parker was an unreasonable tyrant.
Parker severed several relationships between Elvis and his friends that Parker deemed threatening to his importance. He was described by one friend of Elvis's as a hustler and a con artist, that he was really only interested in the now money, to get a buck and get gone. Thanks to the Colonel, the only close relationships Elvis had were his parents, Vernon and Gladys, who were just about as loving and supportive as any parents have ever been.
In 1957, a few days before Christmas, Elvis received his draft card at his mansion home, Graceland. 3 months later, he was sworn in as a private for the Army in Memphis and was then stationed in Germany. When he was in the Army, serving for 18 months, he worked on his voice, and Elvis recordings after this point sound really good. He's deeper, richer, and more full. But while he was in the Army, he was also developing an addiction.
At this point in history, the US Army was giving pills to soldiers that helped them stay awake longer, improve their moods, and suppress their appetites. Today, we would call this speed. Elvis was staunchly anti-drug his whole life, even attempting to become an agent for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, but because the Army gave him the pills, he didn't really see them as drugs. His addiction would never go away. While Elvis met his future wife Priscilla Presley in Germany, he also lost his mother to a heart attack, which completely shook his support structure and left a hole in his heart for the rest of his years.
When Elvis returned from his military service in 1960. Parker was ready to capitalize. They released Elvis Is Back, which is his first batch of new material since he left for the Army, and it's pretty good. It's one of my favorite Elvis records. They began to work on a bunch of other projects, and Parker realized that as far as marketing went, Elvis could do almost no better than the movies. The formula was pretty simple. Put Elvis in an exotic location, have him be around a couple of pretty girls, have him sing a couple of love songs, and maybe get into a fight. Every plot was nearly identical, and even though some of the fight scenes are pretty good, Elvis played the same character pretty much every time. Then after the movie comes out, you release a soundtrack album to go with it. The movie helps sell LPs, and the LPs help drive ticket sales. Most importantly, the films were cheap, and they made money. Elvis honestly wasn't a bad actor, but most of the films he was in gave him nothing to work with. A lot of them were obviously written by people who had never met or didn't understand America's youth, who the movies were directly for.
The problem was this formula got old fast, especially for the star. Elvis was actually very eager to challenge himself and try to play serious roles, but that would be a risk for the bottom line, a risk that Parker was not willing to take. Elvis asked to try films where he didn't have to sing, and he was denied. The only film in which he did not sing was a Western called Charo, and technically he sings the intro theme song.
By the time movie ticket and soundtrack sales couldn't justify keeping this charade up anymore, Elvis was completely miserable. He was spending more time away from his family and just generally hating the material he was putting out. Sidemen Scotty Moore and Bill Black, who'd been 10 feet from stardom the whole time, eventually quit over their pay and treatment. Elvis hadn't performed on stage live in 7 years, but that was all about to change with one last shot at greatness.
This is the high point in the roller coaster, right before a swift drop. In 1968, NBC conceived of a television special to reintroduce Elvis to the masses. It would be a Christmas broadcast featuring huge, choreographed musical numbers and a more intimate sit-down show where his band and a crowd were close to the action. Director Steve Binder's ideas for updating Elvis's look and sound were phenomenal, and what has become informally known as the 68 Comeback Special is, in our opinion, the best thing Elvis ever did. It includes his best song, If I Can Dream, and arguing for its inclusion in the set was the only time Elvis ever stood up to Parker. Accompanying the special, Elvis cut a few really good records back in Memphis that kind of reminded everybody why they liked him in the first place. He was obviously having fun, he seemed healthy, and importantly, he was satisfied with the product, saying, I'm never going to do another song I don't believe in. I'm never going to do another picture I don't believe in. One last time, he was on top.
This is where things go downhill fast. Following the Comeback Special, Elvis and Parker quickly inked a deal with the International Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada, as Elvis looked forward to returning to live performances. In 1969, Elvis began an alternating schedule of touring and performing residencies at the International, performing 636 sold-out performances in a row, which is a record that still stands in Vegas today.
Elvis was drawn to the 24-hour lifestyle of Las Vegas, and his pill usage increased to keep him awake while taking barbiturates to be able to sleep. According to Elvis's friend and Memphis Mafia member Joe Esposito, it was like a party you wouldn't believe. You go to a different show every night, go pick up a bunch of women afterwards, and go to a party the next night. Go to the lounges, see all the old acts. We'd stay there and never sleep. We were taking pills just so we could keep up with each other.
Elvis had never really gotten over the death of his mother in 1958, and then his marriage with Priscilla dissolved in 1973. He surrounded himself with sycophants who became known as the Memphis Mafia, for whom he spent money with abandon. I mean, he would buy Cadillacs for people completely at random. While a lifelong Christian, Elvis began looking for meaning in different philosophies, like New Age beliefs and esoteric mysticism, and practices like karate. As the 70s progressed, he began wearing those signature jumpsuits on stage, which were based on his karate gis, and they gradually got more ridiculous, more expensive, and heavier.
As his mental health deteriorated, so did his physical health. Daily, Elvis ate an entire fool's gold loaf, a whole loaf of Italian bread stuffed with a pound of bacon, peanut butter, and grape jam. He needed round-the-clock nursing staff to help him with everyday tasks, and his personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, who Elvis simply called Dr. Nick, prescribed more than 10,000 individual doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics in the first 7 months of 1977 alone. The final days of Elvis's public life in 77 paint a picture of a deeply unhappy person with a slurring, zombie-like appearance. It's really tough to look at.
I don't know all the chords, so if you hear me get my fingers caught in keys back here, you know what it is.
On Elvis's final tour, it seemed like you couldn't get him on stage and he couldn't wait to get off stage, performing 40-minute sets. But at Elvis's final gig, things were different. Peter Guralnick notes in his book Careless, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, his last show displayed an energy and a vitality that had been missing from the entire tour. He did an 80-minute set, including rare songs Bridge Over Troubled Water and Hurt. He brought his father out on stage, introduced various friends and relatives, and at the conclusion of the final number, put the mic down and walked back and forth shaking hands, as if he really didn't want to leave.
But perhaps most strangely, Elvis did something to his final song. The perennial closer was Can't Help Falling in Love, which begins, wise men say, only fools rush in, but I can't help falling in love with you. But Elvis changed the lyrics that night. He sang, wise men know when it's time to go. About 2 months later, he died. Or did he?
On August 16, 1977, after a night hanging out at home at Graceland, Elvis went to bed at 5 in the morning. He was taking painkillers from a dentist appointment he'd had the day before, and he took 3 different doses because he probably didn't remember if he had taken any yet. Sometime later, he got out of bed to use the bathroom. At 1:30 in the afternoon, his girlfriend began knocking on the door, to which she received no answer. She apparently found his motionless body in front of the toilet and called out frantically, to which the Memphis Mafia responded. They surrounded Elvis immediately. Lisa Marie Presley, who was 9 at the time, remembers calling out for her dad, and no one would let her see him. At 2:30 in the afternoon, an ambulance arrived and Elvis was taken to Baptist Memorial Hospital. Only Vernon was allowed to accompany the body.
While Elvis was at the hospital, maids deep cleaned Graceland. The floor was scrubbed, leaving no evidence of Elvis's misadventure. But remember those 10,000 pills his doctor had prescribed? There was no medication found in the house, not even an aspirin. Vernon quickly announced via a press conference just a few hours later that his son was dead. Strangely, the hospital record says that the autopsy was performed within 2.5 hours of Elvis arriving at the hospital, but according to PBS, autopsies usually take around 4 hours, and the report takes anywhere between 1 to 6 weeks to prepare. Even stranger, medical examiner Jerry Francisco concluded an irregular heartbeat was on the autopsy report, a condition that can only be diagnosed while a person is alive.
Stories of a conspiracy began immediately. Only one photo of a dead Elvis exists, and it was taken at his funeral by his cousin, who was paid $180,000 by the National Enquirer to do so. It strikes many people as strange, with the corpse appearing more like Elvis in the late 50s than how he looked in the late 70s. Mae Axton, a friend of the family who had helped write Heartbreak Hotel, called Vernon when she heard of Elvis's death, and Vernon told her, "Don't even come to the funeral. It's not Elvis in the coffin."
One day after Elvis's death, a man reporting to look like the rock star boarded a one-way flight to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, backing up real quick, Elvis used the pseudonym John Burroughs while booking hotels and such to avoid unnecessary media attention. Here's the note that he left President Nixon when he visited D.C., for example. Anyways, any guesses to the name on the ticket to Buenos Aires? That's right, John Burroughs.
13 days after Elvis's death, there was a grave robbing attempt on his crypt. Now, Vernon had wanted Elvis to be buried in Graceland and had asked Shelby County, Tennessee to do so, but because Graceland was not zoned for dead bodies, he was denied, and he was buried in the Forest Hills Cemetery about 5 miles away from Graceland. On August 29th, a man named Ronnie Atkins phoned Memphis PD to let them know that someone was going to attempt to steal Elvis's body. Memphis police staked out the crypt for a couple of nights, and 3 days later, a couple of men showed up in the dead of night, including Ronnie Atkins himself. Despite the body being in a steel-lined casket weighing 900 pounds, sitting behind 2 slabs of concrete and a sheet of marble, the men who showed up to rob the grave had no explosives or even a getaway car to take the body away. They were all arrested, and fearing more stunts like this, Shelby County allowed Vernon to move the body to Graceland, where it sits today. Elvis is reinterred at Graceland, where his name is famously misspelled on his grave marker.
On New Year's Eve 1977, the Presley family friend and journalist Mike Joseph visited the Graceland grounds, taking photos. Now, this is years before Graceland is open to the public as a museum, but he still caught someone through his lens, with the resulting photo being known as the pool house photo. What do you think?
Some theorists think witness protection is an explanation for why Elvis disappeared. In mid-1977, Elvis had been fleeced for close to $10 million in a bad investment in private planes from a California group known as the Fraternity. What Elvis did not know is that the Fraternity was led by LA mob boss Paul Castellano. Although we couldn't find any evidence for it, some journalists have asserted that Elvis was a mole for the FBI and testified against the Fraternity and had to be relocated for his own safety.
Remember Colonel Tom Parker, whose whole identity was fabricated? Despite his fake everything, Parker still had a passport, a birth certificate, a driver's license, and a social security number displaying the name Tom Parker. It seemed like his connections were not just in the entertainment industry, but also maybe a little seedier. Would he have known how to give Elvis a fake identity?
Author Gail Brewer Giorgio, who's written several books about death conspiracies relating to Elvis, claims to have come into possession of a tape recorded 4 years after he died, and she says features him talking about disappearing from public life.
People ask me all the time where I'm living. Naturally, I can't say, but it's a good place to hide. There was an island that I had learned about a long time ago, and I guess I always knew that someday I'd probably have to use it. Anyway, I must have spent a year on the island.
Voice recognition expert L.H. Williams claims that he believes this is the voice of Elvis, saying the known voice of Elvis Presley, compared with the voice on this tape, is the same. Now let's breeze through some potential later sightings.
He too grew up very, very poor.
Yeah, Paul.
And it's exactly what you said the other day. Oh, right. Oh.
Maybe the funniest yet somehow most compelling piece of evidence of Elvis still being alive is Pastor Bob Joyce, who bears a remarkable resemblance to the king. Pastor Bob Joyce preaches in Benton, Arkansas. He sings and plays guitar and piano pretty similarly to Elvis. The two even share a birthday. There's some absolutely rabid communities online who believe wholeheartedly that this is Elvis. And I gotta say, at least seems sort of plausible. When Elvis's longtime friend George Klein died in 2019, of course you'd expect Priscilla Presley to be there. And after she said a few words at the funeral, she went back to her pew, patted someone on the shoulder on the way to sit down to console him. And that man is Pastor Bob Joyce.
Now, do we believe with any degree of certainty that Elvis is actually out there alive today? No, not really, but the conspiracies are fun. Plus, conspiracies, and I mean harmless ones like this, not like scary ones like 9/11 trutherism, are fun to pick apart with our students. Now, if you want to go do some investigating, you could go to Graceland in Memphis, but we would actually suggest going to the nearby Sun Records where he made his first recordings. It's a lot cooler and a lot cheaper. But Elvis, as a singer, as a style icon, as an iconoclast, as a human being, is infinitely interesting. While he's not the king of rock and roll, that title belongs to Chuck Berry, he is so much more than Jailhouse Rock and Hound Dog.
I will not fade away. I will not fade